was your past week? Today is the third Sunday of September. We will continue with our 179th Chronological Bible History Lecture. Today is the ninth session on the general epistles, and we will look at Jude and the introduction to the book of Revelation. Today's title is, My Beloved Children, I am with you. My beloved children, I am with you. With this title, we will share today's Bible lecture. First, I will read today's Bible text, the book of Jude chapter 1 verses 5 to 11. It says, Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Yet in like manner these people also, relying on their dreams, defile the flesh, reject authority, and blaspheme the glorious ones. But when the archangel Michael, contending with the devil, was disputing about the body of Moses, he did not presume to pronounce a blasphemous judgment, but said, The Lord rebuke you. But these people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Woe to them! For they walked in the way of Cain and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. Up to now we have examined the epistles of the Apostle John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. From the first Sunday of March 2022 on March 6th until now, we have been running for 3 years and 7 months through our 5th chronological Bible lecture, examining history from creation to almost the very end of the New Testament. What remains now are Jude and Revelation. According to our plan, Revelation will be finished in the 3rd week of December, so let's continue to examine it well until the end. Today we will first look at Jude. The most important historical background for understanding the Bible is the same era that we heard about repeatedly over the past few weeks while examining the epistles of Peter and John. You just need to keep that historical situation in mind as you read. Jude is considered to have been written around AD 70 to 80. If you refer to verse 14, it quotes the book of Enoch, which is a pseudepigrapha. Since the book of Enoch was a book recorded between AD 30 to 50, we can see that Jude was definitely written after that. Also, the content of Jude mentions Gnostic ideas and false teachers that we looked at through John's epistles, so looking at the Gnostic phenomenon that became more prominent after AD 70, and since the author Jude was martyred between AD 70-80, the time of writing for Jude is considered to be between AD 70 to 80. The author of Jude within the book writes that he is the brother of James. Most scholars believe that this Jude is Jesus' brother, Jude. Chapter 1 verse 1 says, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James, to those who have been called, who are loved in God the Father and kept for Jesus Christ. Looking at the text, Jude himself does not say he is the brother of Jesus in the flesh, but says he is the brother of James. Since James was the head of the Jerusalem church and the brother of Jesus in the flesh, we can see that the author Jude was the brother of Jesus. Looking at the content of Jude, with the exception of the greeting and the final doxology, the entire book is a rebuttal of the Gnostic heresy and a revelation of their sins. What is unique about it compared to other books of the Bible is that it tells believers to fight even more strongly for the faith. Chapter 1 verse 3 says, Dear friends, although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, I felt compelled to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to God's holy people. Jude clearly states that he is writing this letter to strongly urge believers to stand firm in their faith and actively resist the heresy that strays from God's will for establishing the church. We may think that believing in Jesus is about living in peace and accepting any kind of behavior if we just gather together. But in reality, protecting the truth requires a very serious and great battle. Since Satan is attacking believers like a roaring lion, no matter how much we try to live in peace, as long as there are beings who are trying to jump in and kill us, we cannot just let them be and pretend we don't know. The truth does not change, but the truth is not protected by itself, it must be protected. Therefore, it is right to say that a believer is like a warrior, a soldier, a champion who protects the truth. So, the Apostle John also encourages us not to forget the love that God has shown us even in such a war. The content of Jude is no different in emphasis from the epistles of Peter and John. So, if you refer to the historical background we have looked at several times, you will be able to correctly understand its meaning as you read Jude. As I just said, Jude includes verses from pseudepigrapha called the Book of Enoch and the Assumption of Moses. In verse 14 he quotes the Book of Enoch, and in verse 9 he mentions the content of a document called the Assumption of Moses. These books were classified as apocrypha or pseudepigrapha when the 66 books of the Bible were canonized. The Book of Enoch was an ancient document that existed before the first books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, or a story that was passed down. The Assumption of Moses was a prophetic book about the future of Israel in the form of Moses talking to Joshua. According to studies on church history, even though the Council of Jamnia in AD 90 did not adopt the Book of Enoch as canonical, the Book of Enoch was a book that was widely read by believers until the time the New Testament was canonized. Things other than the 66 canonical books contained legends of unknown origin and fantastic content, so even though they were considered to be of a low quality, they were always hovering around the Bible and were read by many people, and some of the early church bishops even quoted the Apocrypha. In the case of the books of Maccabees, which the Catholic Church uses in the Bible, we can refer to them for the historical background of the Jewish Maccabean revolt. So, by rightly discerning and referring to these apocryphal books, we can get help in understanding the background of the Bible from various angles. Jude warns that the word of truth that God has given will not change, but if believers do not protect it, it will be hindered by those who add to, subtract from, and interpret the truth as they please, and they will even lose the very reason for their existence as believers. So Jude says that believers must fight for the truth to protect the true value of the word. So, the church and the pulpit must diligently teach believers God's true heart. What is regrettable is how poorly our churches have been teaching believers. Even people who have been going to church for a long time believe a false truth that has no historicity, universality, or ethics, and countless people are following it. In other words, believer education has not been done correctly. So, while it goes without saying that heresy is wrong, the church and believers should repent for not teaching the Bible correctly before blaming the heretics, and they should teach the Bible and history correctly. In the old days, many people were not educated. They may not have known how to read, there may not have been many books, and education may have been difficult, but today the problem is different. Everyone has a high level of education, there are many good books, teaching materials, and there is time. If believers are only willing to commit their time to learning correctly, they can become complete and healthy believers. Now, at the end of the time when the prophecies of the Bible are being fulfilled, let's not forget the important reason why the writings of these apostles were passed down to us. Let's learn and also preach the word correctly and quickly, and let's achieve the fulfillment of the new covenant of planting the Lord's true heart in the hearts of every person. In this way, Jude also warns against the false teachers who are causing confusion in the church, and challenges believers to not be swept away by this atmosphere and to protect the values of the word. If you read the content, remembering what I have just said, you will be able to fully understand it. With this, I will conclude Jude. So, now at last, only the final book of the Bible, Revelation, is left. Congratulations to all of you who have come all the way from Genesis to Revelation. In various places in the Bible there were parts that talked about the end times, but those are literally partial stories. Revelation clearly shows the big picture of the end times. So, when you learn about the end times, it is very important to see the whole through this revelation, rather than other parts of the Bible. Over the next 14 sessions we will examine Revelation. I hope that through Revelation you can calmly know God's heart, which He wants to speak to us who live in the tribulation of this earth as people of eternal heaven, and have a correct eschatological perspective. To correctly understand Revelation, let's first look at the historical and temporal background in which Revelation was written. This is the same as the background we have already looked at repeatedly while covering the post-apostolic books and the general epistles, so it will not be that different. That era was a world where it was not an exaggeration to say that Rome ruled the entire world. Of course, at that time there were places like China and India in the east, but when we talk about the Mediterranean world related to the Bible, Rome almost ruled the entire world. The reason why Christians who were first persecuted by the Jews began to be persecuted by the Roman government was because of the difference in the worldview and religious view of the Roman Empire. The reason why the Romans despised Christianity was not that Christianity claimed that a human was God. For the Romans, who also thought of their emperor a human as a god, this part was not a problem. The problem was that the person Christians worshipped was a despicable criminal, a country bumpkin from Galilee who was crucified. Rome deified humans, but only people who had left behind great achievements like the emperor. From the perspective of the Romans' worldview, a person had to be at least a being who could conquer the whole world and bring them wealth and peace to be called a god. But Christians, from the Romans' perspective, called a very ordinary, even a country bumpkin, Jesus, the King of Peace, the Savior, the Son of God. It was this part that directly clashed with the religious culture of Rome, their worldview, and the universal values of their society. So, emperor worship, which emphasized loyalty to the Roman Empire, was the biggest problem. In the late 1st century, the time we are now looking at, emperor worship became the core of the Roman state religion. Before religion and the state were separated, loyalty to the Roman gods was considered loyalty to Rome itself. Emperor worship had in fact become one of the state religions from the time of the first Roman emperor, Augustus Octavianus, from 27 BC to AD 14. In other words, loyalty to the emperor became the standard for testing one's loyalty to the Roman Empire. Emperor worship originally began with the system of leader worship that was unique to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. Alexander the Great of Greece had adopted the traditional Persian concept of a divine monarch and deified himself. As time passed, when Rome conquered the Hellenistic regions, it learned of the Greek custom of regarding the king as a god with the power to give blessings. The Roman generals who had conquered the Greek regions received the same worship from the local people. The Romans had traditionally rejected the worship of humans. But through their conquest of the Hellenistic regions, they adopted these cultures, and things related to emperor worship first began to happen during the time of Emperor Augustus. In 27 BC, the Roman Senate gave Octavius the name Augustus, which means exalted one, giving him a status higher than a human mortal, but lower than a god. When he died in AD 14, the Roman Senate raised him to the status of a god. As long as an emperor was not excommunicated by the Senate, or did not demand emperor worship himself while he was alive, going against Roman tradition. When an emperor died, the Senate would grant the dead emperor the status of a god. For example, the unpopular Emperor Tiberius, the second emperor, 42 BC 37 AD, did not receive the status of a god. Caligula, the third emperor AD 37-41, Nero, the fifth emperor AD 54-68, and Domitian, the 11th emperor AD 81-96, also did not become gods, because they all demanded various conditions of worship themselves while they were alive, which did not fit the Roman way of thinking. They knew that they were just human beings, but even if the emperor himself held the power of the world, his actions of demanding to be worshipped as a god while he was alive would naturally clash with the universal thinking of the people. So, in the cases of Nero and Domitian, because of the wrongdoing they committed, they were officially convicted by the Senate, and even sentenced to damnatio memoriae, where the records of them were erased from history. In any case, emperor worship developed more in the regions ruled by Rome, the conquered regions, as a result of building temples for emperor worship as a form of flattery to receive the emperor's attention. The rulers of the Asian regions, which were under Roman rule, took the lead in promoting emperor worship. In this atmosphere, having a temple that the emperor directly approved of became a great honor for the city and the province. So, even within a single province, there was intense competition to build temples in each city. The provincial assembly and senators, who wanted the prosperity of their city, showed their fervent loyalty to the Roman emperor and tried to flatter him. So the interest of the rulers and officials in all the conquered regions of Rome had no choice but to be focused on the emperor worship policy, which could protect and maintain their power. And for those who did not join forces with this policy and did not want to worship the emperor, it was seen as a very serious act of treason. These backgrounds provide a good basis for interpreting the book of Revelation. Of the 7 churches mentioned in Revelation, 3 cities, Pergamum, Ephesus and Smyrna, had temples for emperor worship. So, the Christians in the region of Asia Minor, just like in many other regions, found themselves in the center of very serious persecution and oppression. It was during this time that the Apostle John wrote Revelation to the churches in the 1st century in the region of Asia Minor. Emperor worship, from the perspective of the word, inevitably led to a conflict with the local rulers who promoted emperor worship, as Christians could never worship the emperor. And it became the starting point for a clash with the highest authority of the Roman Empire. This issue of emperor worship became the most acute issue during the time of Emperor Domitian. Domitian was the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, which began in AD 69 under Emperor Vespasian, who became a recognized emperor after Nero. It is said that Emperor Vespasian actively encouraged emperor worship to firmly establish his dynasty and secure the loyalty of each province. Although his first son, Titus, who had conquered Jerusalem, did not rule for long, AD 79 to 81, his second son Domitian was on the throne for 15 years, AD 81 to 96. Roman historians describe Domitian as a dictator who was obsessed with his own deification and was stubborn about it. According to records, Domitian demanded to be called Lord and God. The time he reigned was naturally the worst time for Christians, and his last 4 years of rule, AD 93 to 96, went to extremes, with severe persecution being inflicted on Christian believers. Especially in the region of Asia Minor, Ephesus, during Domitian's time, as I mentioned several times. The severe persecution of Christians was partly due to Emperor Domitian's megalomania, but as I said a little while ago, it was the result of the competition among the regions to show excessive loyalty through emperor worship. When Domitian gave the Ephesus region of Asia Minor the privilege of building a temple that he approved of Neocrate, the local officials who wanted to show their loyalty to Rome became very tyrannical. As a result, the severe oppression and persecution against Christians were truly a terror in itself. So, at that time, other apostles of Jesus, including the Apostle Paul, had all been martyred, and John was the only apostle left ministering in the church of Ephesus. John's later years were spent under the rule of Domitian. As Domitian demanded emperor worship, claiming to be a god even while alive, the second persecution against Christians was carried out very severely. And it was in this historical period that Revelation was written. The Romans' view of Christians at that time was that they were atheists because, unlike the Romans who worshipped many gods, which was very common to them, Christians believed in only one unseen God. The Greco-Roman world was more than just a polytheistic world. The Greek poet Hesiodos claimed that the number of gods was over 30,000. The gods we are familiar with, such as Zeus, Artemis, Diana, and Apollo, were the central beings of the gods they worshipped. They accepted various gods that were worshipped in Greece, Egypt, Syria, and all other nations, and they created a pantheon and coexisted together. Most cities had 15 to 20 major temples. In addition to these gods, there were countless other miscellaneous gods, and each god had its own shrine and worshippers. But Christians were unique in that they did not believe in or acknowledge the existence of the various gods that all the people of that era believed in and worshipped together. The Jews, along with the Christians, only proclaimed the one and only God and did not treat other gods as gods. So the Romans saw such Christians as atheists, and having such an anti-Roman religious view was seen as a rejection of the Roman government, and a form of rebellion against the emperor. Another misconception that the Romans had about Christians was that they saw Christians as barbaric beings who practiced human sacrifice. Christians were always practicing the Lord's Supper that Jesus had commanded. On the night before Jesus was arrested, he shared the Last Supper with his disciples and broke bread and shared a cup of wine, saying, "This is my body and blood." He told them to do this until he returned, so that they would not forget that the era of the Old Covenant, which was made with the blood of animals, had ended and a new era of the New Covenant, which was made with Jesus' blood, had begun. But the Romans misunderstood the practice of this Holy Communion. They misunderstood that these people were practicing human sacrifice and eating human flesh and blood. Lies even spread that they were sacrificing their own children. So, even when natural disasters like famine, plague, or earthquakes occurred, the blame was shifted to the Christians, saying that all the Roman gods were angry because of them. It was as if they were taking on all the social responsibility. This was the basic perception of the Romans toward Christians. But with Emperor Domitian stepping up and forcing emperor worship, and all the cities promoting it as right to please the emperor, Christians were not following that emperor worship. So, they were misunderstood even more, and the persecution and suffering they received were very severe. At the time of Emperor Nero, they had experienced very harsh persecution. If they were to be killed by beheading or shooting all at once, it might have been an easy way out. But the Romans did not see Christians as normal people, so they did not just kill them. They would torture them very harshly and torment them cruelly, creating a sense of terror in others and making them unable to resist. They were torn apart by hungry wild animals, crucified and burned at the stake. They were killed in the worst way possible in a terrifying manner. Especially in the region of Asia Minor, Ephesus during Domitian's time, as I mentioned several times, the severe persecution of Christians was related to emperor worship. The local officials were even more eager to take the lead in building the emperor's shrine, and were in a frenzy of excessive loyalty. So, they would catch Christians wherever they saw them, put them in forced labor, or use the church leaders as a frightening example to torture and kill them. This must have happened often. So, the church workers in the churches of Asia Minor, with Ephesus as their center, were the first to be targeted for arrest, so they must have been the most terrified. Not only the church workers but also any believer at that time would have been filled with extreme anxiety and fear. So, if this was the atmosphere for believing in Jesus, even if they were going to church, there would have been people who had no choice but to deny their faith out of extreme fear. At the time of Nero's persecution, they believed that Jesus would come soon, even as they were suffering. But then some people would say, "What's the point of waiting? It's a lie." And they would leave the church. And on the other hand, there would have been some who waited for the second coming in an extreme way, thinking that this time Jesus would surely come. In this way, the church and believers of that era were thrown into chaos by the great fear caused by persecution and oppression. But when we look at history, this persecution by Emperor Domitian was only the second of the 10 persecutions by the Roman government. There would be 8 more harsh periods to come over the next 200 years. Looking at these persecutions in order. The first was Nero's persecution for about 3.5 years from AD 64-67. The second was Domitian's persecution for about 7 years from AD 90-96. The third was Trajan's persecution for about 20 years from AD 98-117. The fourth was Hadrian's persecution for about 20 years from AD 117-138. This persecution, which followed Trajan's persecution, lasted for a long time of about 40 to 50 years. The fifth was Marcus Aurelius' persecution for a long time of about 20 years from AD 161-180. The sixth was Septimius Severus' persecution for about 10 years from AD 202-211. The seventh was Maximinus' persecution for about 2 years from AD 235-236. The eighth was Decius' persecution for about 3 years from AD 249-251. The ninth was Valerian's persecution for about 4 years from AD 257-260. The 10th was Diocletian Galerius' persecution for about 8 years from AD 303 to 311. In this way, the period of persecution lasted for over 200 years until Christianity was legalized by Emperor Constantine in AD 313. If you add up the periods of persecution, it would be about 100 years. And the time we are now examining, Domitian's persecution, was the second of the 10 persecutions. So, in a situation like this, who would be the most worried and heartbroken? The believers? The church workers? It could be, but above all it would be God who created this church and God who gathered the believers into the church. And it would be God who had to see his children suffer within that church. When God the Father had to see his children suffering in the church he gathered because of these tyrants, his heart was torn and he was in so much pain. Our Jesus, who knew this future history and pain, was the most heartbroken. So, if you look at the beginning of Revelation in chapter 1, you can see that God first steps up to prepare a solution. He tells Jesus, and through angels, he calls John to the heavenly realm, and shows him visions and revelations, and tells him to comfort the church workers in each church, and to write a letter so that the believers can stand on a more solid and specific hope. So, Revelation is a letter from God the Father to his children who will soon be greatly persecuted, out of his sorrow for them. But then, if such persecution was about to happen, it would seem that God could just use his almighty power to eliminate the main culprits of the persecution and install good kings, but God does not work that way. Why? I don't know. But the Bible shows us this fact. God's solution is not to remove the tribulation and the great trial that is coming to believers beforehand. Instead, we must remember well that God makes believers, with a faith that believes in God's promise, walk on their own according to the values of the Word that God has told them beforehand in the place of mission where they each belong. So, God tells His people, hold on to God's promise, the hope that God has told you beforehand. The path of an easy life for those who believe in Jesus was an unimaginable thing in the history of the Bible. A believer is a being who is called to be light, and is sent into the darkness to illuminate the dark world. So, the rough and difficult waves that come to a believer are natural. It is natural for Christians to be persecuted by the world, since they are walking a path that is contrary to the path God called them to. So, instead of trying to avoid persecution, praying for the strength to overcome that difficulty, praying for the hope to be able to go forward even in the darkness, is praying according to God's will. Persecution is a fearful thing, but having no hope is even more despairing. So, Jesus gives a hope that is even greater than what can overcome persecution to His people who are in fear because of persecution. A precious hope that cannot be exchanged even for one's life. Just as God made them know about eternal hope, true hope, through the Apostle Peter, He Himself first tells His people who are in the fear of persecution the true hope that they must hold on to. People don't fall because they are persecuted and are in pain. Most of the time they fall because they have no hope. In fact, persecution can be an opportunity to make people purer and holier. Persecution that comes to those who are holding on to hope instead gives them the strength to hold on to hope even more strongly. So, God does not remove persecution from His people. Instead, He makes them know about a more solid hope. How did God convey hope to His people at that time? By having the Apostle John write a letter. So let's not forget that this revelation of John is a letter that conveys hope to the believers who are in persecution and tribulation. A letter of hope that God is sending to His believers as we examine it. So, as we will learn as we look at it, in chapters 2 and 3 God says, write a letter to each of the 7 churches of Asia Minor. We can see God's work of carefully watching and protecting each church. Just as God watches over us like the apple of His eye, and He knows this reality that we are walking in, and He walks with us, where could there be a greater hope than that? So, when we look at the message that is sent to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, where the persecution was the most severe, God does not tell them how to escape persecution. Instead, He tells them to bravely follow the path that Jesus walked first, living like light and salt according to the values of the Word, and He tells them that at the end of that path we have a true hope that belongs to heaven. And as we continue to look at the many visions and revelations that are shown to the Apostle John from chapter 4 to 22, we must remember well that it is a letter from Jesus that comforts and encourages the believers who are trembling in fear. A letter that gives them hope to be able to walk the path of true truth, not a way to escape the path of persecution. Let's examine Revelation with this in mind. Why do I keep wanting to keep in mind the fact that it is a letter? Because this book of Revelation, the last book of the Old and New Testaments, is the most difficult and obscure book in the Bible, and it has historically given rise to many misunderstandings and misinterpretations. From the day it was written until this very moment, Revelation has always been a difficult book. There is no Bible scholar or theologian who would say that Revelation is not difficult. Historically, many people have tried to correctly interpret Revelation, but they have never been able to agree, and it is true that even when you read it, you don't feel a sense of certainty. In the case of the great reformer, Martin Luther, he said that for every word written in this book, there were as many riddles. If even a reformer said such a thing, who would dare to think that they could read Revelation correctly? Also, in the case of John Calvin, who can be said to be a truly great theologian in the history of Christianity, he was a person who actually preached from Genesis verse by verse without skipping a single one, but he preached up to Revelation chapter 3, and from chapter 4 he said, honestly I don't know, and he stopped. There are various speculations about the reason for this, but rather than saying he honestly didn't know, it is believed that he did not cover Revelation for 3 complex reasons: theological repulsion toward the indiscriminate eschatological interpretations of the time, his rigorous methodology for biblical interpretation, and the immense volume of work. When you see that even Calvin, who had such an excellent intellect and is said to have laid the foundation of Christian theology, did not cover it, you come to think that Revelation is a truly difficult book that cannot be unraveled carelessly. So naturally, Revelation came to be seen as an extremely difficult book, and a book you'd better not touch carelessly or something bad will happen. So many pastors did not touch it, saying that even if you don't know Revelation, it doesn't hinder your salvation. In fact, it was treated as a book that could not be, and should not be, unraveled correctly by anyone. Nevertheless, the methods that were attempted to unravel Revelation were mostly based on a wrong eschatology, and so preconceptions were created, and Revelation was not seen clearly. If you have a wrong perspective, you are bound to make an overinterpretation or an unreasonable interpretation. So, their perspective on Revelation was not flexible. If you have a biased or fixed perspective, you can't see the core message of other books, not just Revelation. When we look at the Bible, if our perspective is too strong, it's like we can't hear God's voice. If our perspective on the Bible is that it is a gold mine for blessings, then no matter how simple the words of the Bible are, we have no choice but to misunderstand and interpret them differently. When we are biased or caught in a fixed idea, we cannot see God's will. So, their perspective on Revelation was not flexible. Another reason why it was difficult to even read Revelation was a lack of a correct understanding of the Old Testament. It's not that they only didn't know Revelation, it's that they didn't know the history of the Bible that led to the giving of this promise of Revelation. The history of the Bible that we have looked at so far shows us that the history of the Old Testament makes up the majority of the Bible, and the history of the New Testament is only about 100 years from the time Jesus was born. So, many parts of Revelation, which is like the conclusion of the Bible, use a lot of visions and examples based on the history of the Old Testament, because it is talking about the results that have been connected over time from the events that happened in the history of the Old Testament. But they were taught that the Old Testament was all over with the coming of Jesus, and that it had nothing to do with us who live in the New Testament. So they had no knowledge of the prologue and the main body that would make them know the result of Revelation. So, they couldn't correctly see Revelation, which can be called the conclusion of the Bible. If you don't know the history of the Old Testament well, Revelation is a book that you really can't see. So you must faithfully and correctly examine the history of the Bible from creation up to Revelation, so that you can have the perspective to correctly see Revelation, which can be called the conclusion of the Bible. Revelation is a very important message for us believers who live in the New Covenant era. What is the core message of the entire Old Testament? It is the story of the Messiah who is to come to this earth. So, when Jesus came to this earth and proclaimed that fact, we came to believe through the prophecies of the Bible that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of the living God. So the New Covenant Church began, and we became people of that kingdom of God. But what did that Jesus command and promise us after he died on the cross, was resurrected and ascended to heaven? That very important command and the mission he gave us is the story of the New Testament. And above all, the core of the New Covenant is the promise of the second coming of Jesus, who died for us, was resurrected, and is now at the right hand of God in heaven. If the Old Testament is the prophecy and story of the Messiah who is to come to this earth, the New Testament is the prophecy and story of that Jesus who is to come again to this earth. The only book that tells us what it will be like when Jesus comes again is the book of Revelation. So, it is a very important posture for us believers to know the time and signs of the second coming of Jesus through this revelation. If we do not know Revelation correctly, we will do the exact same thing as the Jewish Pharisees, who could not see Jesus as the Christ and Messiah when he first came to this earth. So, while we listen to and refer to the various stories of others, we must first read Revelation correctly ourselves, and be able to have a correct and complete perspective on the Lord's second coming. We must be able to tell our next generation this correct perspective. Let's not forget. To summarize the whole thing, Revelation is a letter of hope that God sent to his people who were in fear and trembling from the threat of death, social isolation, and so on, that came from the persecution of the Roman government when they said they believed in Jesus in their daily lives. In that letter, God tells them the reason they should live as people of heaven and the mission for their existence in this world even in such pain. He gives them hope to live worthy of believers, and to give them the courage of faith to walk the path of truth, not the path of compromising with the world. The blessing we have in this day and age is that even though we may have had preconceptions about Revelation and saw it as just difficult from an inflexible perspective, nevertheless the pondering, studying, and continuous obedience of our predecessors in faith, who wanted to hear God's will, have allowed us to understand Revelation more correctly. Also, as time has passed, we have been able to see how the history of the Bible was fulfilled and realized according to the Word in time. So, we can see a little more clearly what our predecessors in faith found difficult and impossible. Let's not forget this fact, and let's not forget that Revelation is a letter of hope that God Himself sent to those who are anxious and in fear in this world. And let's calmly read Revelation together over the next month or two. I will conclude today's message here, and we'll continue to look at the contents of Revelation next week. Let's meditate and pray together for a moment. Let's think about why believers who have become people of God through Jesus Christ are so shaken by the secular world and are forgetting their mission. Or why, even when they are in their place of mission, they act like religious slaves begrudgingly and with difficulty. Is it because the persecution and temptation that come to us are so strong that we cannot overcome them? No, that's not it. The reason we fall into the world even while we are on the path of life is that we have lost the heavenly hope and true hope that God promised us. We have forgotten the hope of heaven that God has clearly promised us, and we are filled with the desire to enjoy the secular and what the world enjoys. So, instead of trying to be a light in the darkness, we have fallen into the trap of trying to have more and better things than the people who live according to their instincts and greed in that dark world, even by using God's power. Since we have no hope of heaven, this world has become everything, and we have decided to live as we please since we only live once. I hope you will not forget the hope of heaven. God did not make His people who are persecuted and tempted on this earth avoid that persecution and temptation. Instead, He is the one who makes them walk like light and salt, like priests to all nations, as believers who hold on to His faithful promise and hold on to the hope of heaven on that path. As we examine Revelation this time, I hope that you will be able to enjoy a heavenly hope and a heavenly peace that this world cannot give or know. So, recalling the words we have just meditated on, let's pray together. God, I repent for not holding on to the heavenly hope that you have clearly given to your people, and for making excuses to you that I find it difficult to endure the persecution and temptation because I wanted to live like the world, and for living a life of blaming you. Lord, as a holy nation called to be light in the darkness, as a people who are God's possession, and as priests to all nations, I will live according to your will in any situation and environment. God, thank you for giving us a clear word of revelation about the day you will come and for giving us an unshakable hope for your people who are in fear. Lord, I will not forget that we do not belong to this earth and that we are strangers on this earth, and I want to have a life of faith that lives each day toward our heavenly home that you are waiting for. I resolve to go forward without change in your calling this week and to live a life as a holy witness. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.